Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, August 29th, 2022. And today we all live or toil under the largest government in the history of the world, but a lot of people still like to throw out the claim that we instead live in the land of the free. So on this episode, I've got 4 telltale signs from the view and the opinions of the founders and old revolutionaries that we're actually living under an authoritarian regime, a state of tyranny or despotism. And I think it'll probably keep getting worse and worse and worse as long as these things continue until, well, that's a different episode. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello, a huge thank you to everyone for joining me here today, whether you're watching live or in the archive, you're listening on the podcast, whatever platform you're joining me on. I can't thank you enough for being here. Whether it's your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I want to give people another minute or so to join us, get notifications to join us on the live stream. So I want to say hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Legalese. Good to see you, buddy. Looking forward to your new book. Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Tim Martin in Arizona, Sharon Patriot, Lisa Believe, Kirk Morrison in Camden, South Carolina, Senator DT, always good to see you, Elkhart, Indiana, Too Tall in Washington State. Man, it's beautiful in Washington State. Clay Kent, Dan Reed, good to see you, buddy. Dan's a good friend and the host of the Culinary Libertarian podcast that you guys got to check out as well. And his website, he's got posts and stuff on there that you definitely want to read. Jacob Curley, Tyler B., Nikolai in the Republic of Florida, Christine Meyer, Liberty Revolutionary, morning back to you as well. Tina, Kenneth, and everyone else. Emmett, I know I'm missing a few. There's Brian down in Georgia. Thank you all for being here. I apologize if I missed anybody. I'm just kind of trying to scroll through while we allow people time to join us. But I will look back in the chat later in the episode or sometime over the next day or so. I always like getting the feedback because it really helps me come up with ideas for future episodes. A lot of times questions, comments, pushback, whatever it may be, is really helpful. And all those comments also will help trigger those mainstream platform algorithms and tell them to show us to more people. Andrew Nappy, good to see you, buddy. Anyways, let's get right to this. I'm just going to go right into these 4 in a kind of a countdown fashion. Signs that we're living not in the land of the free, but under an authoritarian regime, a form of an elective despotism is what many of the founders would have called it. But let's start out with George Washington in his farewell address, and he put it this way. I should actually get this scrolled over a little bit so it shows up. Okay, there we go. The alternate domination, this is his farewell address in 1796. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. So number 4 on my list is a faction-first mentality, a faction-first approach to anything and everything. And I think the vast majority of people, because, well, I mean, we can also look to the government-run school system, where they haven't learned anything about the nature and reason for the structure of the Constitution. They know very little. They can maybe name some dates if we're lucky, and that's about it. But they don't understand why the Constitution was crafted in a certain way. They don't understand why liberty is a better approach or why decentralization is the path to it. So little understanding. And out of desperation in many ways, I think people just go to, well, a team-first approach. These guys are worse, so I'm going to go with these guys. And their views on various, well, their views stay the same. It's team first. But when it comes to certain policies, you'll often, I know anyone who spent any time in the cesspool that I have of social media, you'll see how over a period of 4 or 8 years, the same people will support or oppose almost the same type of policy, but it depends on who's in charge. So number 4 is faction first. George Washington, in his farewell address, warned us that this in and of itself is a frightful despotism. And he continued, he said, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Now, mind you, Washington himself thought that this was an extreme scenario, but he recognized the nature of things. If you allow people, or if people choose to take this approach, eventually in the very long run, which he thought it was in the very long run, we're in that very long run right now, eventually this is how things would turn out. And he was not just coming up with these ideas on his own. This is a long part of the American tradition, and of course, many of the founders and old revolutionaries read and learned from a lot of people well before them. One of them was Thomas Gordon in his Works of Sallust in 1744. And he talked about this faction-first approach throughout history. And he says, "It is with measures as with men. They are praised or condemned, not because they are right or wrong, beneficial or hurtful, but because they come from this party or the other." So faction first. The result of that is the best actions are decried as the worst if they arise from one quarter, the worst actions adored as the best if from the other. The resisting of lawless tyrants is at one time rebellion and damnation. To rebel against the most lawful authority is at another time duty and glory. And that's kind of a much more eloquent way of how I was describing it, that people change their tune based on who's doing it and not the principle. And George Washington warned that this would, in and of itself, is a frightful despotism, but it would lead to a permanent and formal one over time. Gordon continued with this, and this is just to sum it up. Party principles are therefore substituted for moral principles. And I think instead of a faction-first approach, we really need to see much more, almost constantly, a principle-first approach. And that's how we try to approach things here at the TAC. We are founded in 2006. People generally think, or they used to at least, that if you support the 10th Amendment, you're a constitutionalist, you must be on Team Red. Well, we were started in 2006 at the height of the Bush administration out of a response to the constant violations of the Constitution that I was seeing, things like the Patriot Act, the War on Drugs, the Real ID Act, foreign policy, and on and on and on. Bailouts, which came out of that as well. And then when the next team comes in charge, it's back and forth and back and forth. But the people who support us, we do have people who consistently are with us over the years, but a lot of people come and go based on the regime in power, the team in power. I covered this danger of factions, Washington, Thomas Gordon, others like Mercy Otis Warren, Adams, and many others in an episode last fall, September 21. The Danger of Factions, Nothing New Under the Sun. That will be in the show notes. I publish a blog post for every single episode 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, and you can find all the stuff that I'm referencing there at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So number 4, in my mind, is faction-first approach rather than principles. Number 3 is standing armies. I've done a number of episodes talking about how federal agencies are a kind of a de facto standing army, how the federal government is turning local police into another form of nationalized police force, basically doing the things that the large permanent standing army, which the founding generation opposed as well, they feared that it would do, but instead of using them, they're definitely using federal agents, militarized federal agents. But you can check out other episodes on that another time. Let's start out with some warnings about the dangers of standing armies. Here from a Democratic Federalist. This is an anti-federalist paper published October 17th, 1787, right after the close of the Philadelphia Convention. The experience of past ages and the result of the inquiries of the best and most celebrated patriots have taught us to dread a standing army above all earthly evils. Not just kind of near the top, not just pretty bad stuff, but the worst of the worst to a Democratic Federalist. We don't know who the author is. I know some people thought it was Tench Cox for some time, but no. Tench was definitely a Federalist and in support. But here's James Madison. Let's go to the Federalist side. This wasn't just some wackadoo anti-Federalist view. James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, he wanted a very centralized national state with a veto power of the federal government over the states. That was one of his original proposals. He wrote to George Washington before the Philadelphia Convention. He thought that without such a thing, this is going to be really, really bad. He thought that was a defensive measure. But here's how Madison put it. The greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies. Now, of course, the founding generation, whether it was the anti-federalists or the federalist side, they lived through the tyranny of a standing army and forcing the will of an empire through force and violence. They lived through the massacre in Boston. They saw what happened at Lexington and Concord and the bloody war that resulted from enforcing the will of a mighty power through a standing army. But it's not just the enforcement tool of a standing army that was considered dangerous. It also led to things like, well, what do you have to support a massive military complex? Debt. And from debt, you have taxes. And that's how James Madison put it. He said, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. And I covered this in a number of episodes as well. But one that I want to point you guys to, in case you haven't checked out, is one talking about how the Second Amendment was actually supposed to be a tool. One of its main four purposes was to be a tool to prevent the need for this greatest danger to liberty, or threat to liberty, as Madison described it, standing armies. The more that the population was armed and trained and armed, and not just in musket and flintlock, but the military-grade weapons of the time, whatever time you live in, the more that the people have that military-level weapons, not just a standard civilian AR. And thank you to Tim and many other people who have been sending me emails helping me understand the difference between that and like the M16, M4, etc. But I'm learning, I'm doing my best. But the founding generation saw an armed populace. Patrick Henry specifically said, the great object is that every man be armed. Everyone should be armed, to prevent the need for a large military complex. So that's how Madison put it. And I will include a link to that episode, Second Amendment to Prevent the Greatest Danger to Liberty, over in the show notes, which, as you know by now, is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So number 3 is standing armies. Number 2 is consolidation, centralization of power. And here's how James Wilson, one of the leading Federalist thinkers of the time, legal minds of the time, his State House Yard speech of October 6, 1787 was probably one of the most influential Federalist positions in support of ratification of the Constitution, far more influential in the various states than the Federalist Papers were. And I think they get an outsized amount of influence these days, maybe because of Hamilton, but that's another episode. Here's how Wilson put it: to support with vigor a single government over the whole extent of the United States would demand a system of the most unqualified and the most unremitted despotism. And we do have some semblance of federalism, very, very little in compared to how it's supposed to be. Most things are kind of a uniform, nationalized blob, and the problem is a lot of time everybody's a busybody. If you live in California and you think people in South Carolina need to do things your way, you're part of the problem, and vice versa. So I'm talking to all my neighbors here, trying to tell them, the ones that'll listen, stop worrying about what people in Texas or Arizona do for their own liberty. My hope is that if someone leads by example, maybe someone else will stop it. But the idea of having a uniform nationalized approach that is enforced or pushed by a central government, whether it's just through funding to manipulate those local governments into doing things. We have a great article from Amy Lepore that we published, and maybe we should send this out as an email blast sometime in the near future, but she's done a lot of research on how the federal government, through funding, and we know with federal money comes federal strings and federal control. It is not a no strings attached situation ever. But she does a lot of great research, and she did a short overview article explaining how the feds have controlled local emergency management response through federal funding, which means the people that align with their views, and we've seen this, especially those of you who live near me here in Southern California, we've seen how this has played out in the last few years. So even if it is a consolidated government just in name only, in practice, in many parts of our day-to-day lives, whether it's what we can grow in our backyard, the size of our toilets, what type of light bulb we have, what type of street light posts are outside. These are all things that are directed and dictated by the central government. How we might be able to defend ourselves, our home, and our property, controlled in many situations by the central consolidated power that is supposed to be the federal government in Washington, D.C. James Wilson thought a single government making all kinds of decisions like this would require an unremitted despotism. We may not be all the way there yet, but I think it's very, very close. Here's how Patrick Henry on the anti-federalist side, total opposite. Many of his speeches were definitely digging at Mr. Wilson, because Mr. Wilson was so influential. And here's how Patrick Henry put it in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. This, I think, was June 9th, 1788. I will include a link to it in the show notes with the proper dates and all that stuff after the show live stream is done. Here's how Henry put it, though. Dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive. So Patrick Henry thought centralization of power was the most destructive thing that could happen. He wanted decentralization, so each area would have their opportunity to do what they do. And, you know, if you think about a market response, if you only have an opportunity to buy one brand of toilet paper, would the toilet paper brand have any incentive to improve? The more competition there are, the marketplace of ideas, the better off we'll all be, because humanity can learn much faster. There's less fighting about it as well when decisions are limited in size and scope, especially territorial scope. Here's Samuel Adams. He said, "The people of the United States under one consolidated government cannot long remain free, or indeed under any kind of government but despotism." Again, we may not be under a total consolidated government as described by the great Montesquieu or as described by James Madison in the Federalist Papers, but it's certainly very close to that. And if the largest government in history isn't a consolidated government, there is not much further that it needs to go to actually get there. Here's Thomas Jefferson, and he really hammered it home in a letter to Joseph C. Cabell, 1816. "What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? Not most of them." And I've really been saying this kind of line over and over because I think it's important to note when the founding generation, who were great students of history, unlike most people alive today, who have no clue about anything beyond the last 4 tweets, for example, or whatever the mainstream media is pushing out as the political soap opera of the day. This issue is the most important thing. Take your faction side. Once that issue is over, we got another one and another one. You forget about everything that happened last week or maybe just 5 hours ago. That's why I think it's so important. The founding generation were great students of history. Even people like Patrick Henry, who was considered not a student of history, was probably far better as a student of history than most of us today. And Jefferson, again, he says, every government which has ever existed under the sun. Now, of course, Jefferson had a little bit of a flair for the dramatic, like his, we'll call him his colleague, Patrick Henry as well. But he's not messing around here. And even if he's wrong, he's pretty close. What has destroyed liberty in every government, he said, the generalizing and concentrating of all cares and powers into one body. I've done lots of episodes on centralization or consolidation of power, but I think my favorite one on this comes from my first coverage of the first paper of the great anti-federalist writer Brutus. I think the founding generation, anti-federalists and federalists alike, they all agreed about the dangers of consolidation. The debate over ratification was really more so about, well, will this lead to what Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws considered this dangerous centralization or consolidation of powers? That was really the debate. The Federalists said, no, it'll be cool. Or if it does go bad, we're going to have to do some resisting to fix that. And the anti-federalists are like, no, this is going to happen. This is a real problem. But few people explained why. Like, what's the problem with centralizing power? Can't we just get what we want done or something like that? And I don't think anyone did a better job explaining the dangers of consolidation, which is the title of the episode I'm referencing here, than the anti-federalist writer Brutus. I will link to that in the show notes. So number 3 is centralization of power, or what the founders called consolidation. And number 4 is something called arbitrary government. For that, let's start out with the father of the American Revolution, Samuel Adams, who wrote with James Otis Jr. in the Massachusetts Circular Letter, 1768, at the urging of John Dickinson in response to the Townshend Acts. So 1768, they wrote it in response to the 1767 Townshend Act, if you want that kind of detail. Anyway, Samuel Adams, James Otis Jr. said, "In all free states, the Constitution is fixed." And the founders and the old revolutionaries understood what this means. Now, people today would get very confused by that, and I think in most situations. Now, Adams and Otis, they did not mean that a constitution couldn't change. They were talking about the legal meaning of a constitution, that it has this. It's like any legal document. A legal document has the same meaning in law today as the people who gave it legal force understood it to mean at the time they gave it legal force. So for a constitution, if we want to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, we have to understand not just what the Federalist Papers had to say, not just what James Wilson or Samuel Adams, but what the people who ratified it, the people of the several states, the ratifiers of those states, how they debated and understood the legal meaning. But to Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr., well before the drafting of the Constitution, before the War for Independence, that great War of Secession, we can call it, they understood that in order to be a free state, if there is such a thing, you have to have fixed legal meanings in a constitution. It has to stay the same. Otherwise, people in power will merely, and we shouldn't be surprised, they will define things how they see fit to expand their own power. That sounds pretty familiar to all of us these days. Every word that had a meaning 1 year or 6 days ago or 10 or 20 years ago suddenly has a new meaning if it is required to advance a political purpose. So, something that a lot of people in the right to keep and bear arms community consider a kiddie toy accessory, a bump stock, was redefined to be a machine gun, I guess. What was it defined? A machine gun or a part? Now they want to do the same with other parts, pistol braces and things like that. And so if you redefine how things if you redefine the meaning of words, then of course people with power will use those in ways to advance their own power. And we shouldn't be surprised. This is how Federal Farmer, the anti-federalist writer, put it in October of 1787. I think this is paper number 4. Men who govern will, in doubtful cases, construe laws and constitutions most favorably for increasing their own power. So if you have undefined or ambiguous terms, you shouldn't be surprised that even if you can get good people to run things for a while, eventually, well, human nature. And eventually people will look at that and say, well, what can I do with this? I want to get this done. So this means this now. We were warned about this over and over and over. And even at the time when Benjamin Franklin in 1774, I believe, proposed what, kind of a first proposal for an Articles of Confederation, he sent it off to a lot of other people, shopped it around. One of the notes that Thomas Jefferson left, and there's original copies of them out there, maybe just one, in his own hands in the margins, he's writing things about general welfare. And Jefferson said, I don't think we should have terms like this in an Articles of Confederation because it's something that can be misconstrued. And that's something that Brutus and Cato and many of the other anti-federalist writers talked about during the ratification debates. They could even agree, not necessarily, I don't know for sure if they did, but they could see the legal argument made by Mr. Wilson and the Federalist and many others on the Federalist side, talking about the legal meaning of phrases like general welfare and commerce and necessary and proper. And they're saying, well, yeah, okay, but it still could be misused by people in the future. And we are such students of human nature and of history that this is our warning. So that's basically what Federal Farmer is getting at here. So if there's any doubt over the meaning of something, they're going to, over time, use the meaning of that to expand their own power. John Dickinson, who was, we could call him in many ways, the father of the Articles of Confederation. The original first draft of it is that we have in history now is in his handwriting. But he decided to go in support of the Constitution. And here he is some years earlier talking about the same mentality, that people with power will always try to expand their power by construing the legal meanings of things in ways favorable to them. All artful rulers, Dickinson said, who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits, endeavor to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as power. And we know that when we allow them to do this kind of stuff, and now mind you, even if something is, and this is kind of getting into another episode that I need to cover on this, how to deal with these things, and I've done that number of them, and maybe I'll include some links in the show notes as well for those of you who may be wondering, okay, I'm on board with this, but what the hell do we do about it? Eventually, if the people don't A, understand what the original legal meaning is, and then B, when government goes beyond it, do things to prevent it from happening ever again, to stop it, then over time, we shouldn't be surprised when eventually those limits on paper, they're just dead letter. There are no limits at all in practice or effect. And that's how Samuel Adams put it. He said, power without restraint, without any restraint, is tyranny. Power without any restraint is tyranny. Now, the founders and the old revolutionaries called this type of government a government that could really define the limits of its own power, that could redefine words and expand its own power on a political whim for the political needs of the day. This unrestrained, living, breathing approach to a constitution, they called it arbitrary government. Arbitrary government was one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And I covered that in some detail in another episode, of course, that I will link to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. Arbitrary government, how the founders defined tyranny. And again, I will link to that in the show notes when I publish the blog post. So if you kind of go over all of this, when people focus on a faction-first approach rather than liberty, rather than a constitution approach, first approach, principles over party rather than party over principles. Thomas Paine warned us that in the absence of a constitution, party governs principle rather than the other way around. And if the constitution isn't being followed or demanded or enforced by the people, because it's the people's document for the government, it's not the government's job to define its own power, government will always grow. So when you have this faction-first approach, you shouldn't be surprised when government grows. And then the larger and larger it gets, the more that it has to rely on force, because you've got two teams dividing and diverging over every issue, and it switches back and forth, and whoever's in charge has to use things like a standing army or militarized de facto federal agency style federal army or standing army to keep things going in their direction. And that leads, of course, to more and more centralization and consolidation of power. And almost everything that the federal or general or central government of today they do, it really is arbitrary power because it's not authorized by the Constitution. And when you have that, it leads people who are desperate for change and ignorant of how things are supposed to be, ignorant of how to do the change, to focus more on factions first. And then around and around and around and around we go. And just like George Washington warned, it leads to a more formal and permanent despotism. And this is the kind of foundational information that I think is so essential, these base principles, to get out to more and more people. Nothing helps us get that job done. Roll up our sleeves every single day to reach and teach people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is constant. More than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Please don't feel obligated, but 10thamendmentcenter.com/members if you are interested in that. Let me take a look over at the live chat and see if there's anything interesting here. People are recommending some movies and, of course, George Orwell. Haji says the problem with definitions is reminiscent of some arguments made by Sheldon Richman. Oh, if you've got a link to that, I have often loved reading things that Sheldon has done. Great interviews by him as well. Some people are talking about Wikipedia. Dangerous words, says my friend Juliet and Narino. I always get your last name wrong, Juliet. Thank you so much for being here over on YouTube. Anyone else is getting the feed buffering? I apologize for that if there's any trouble, says Sharon. Taking a look a little bit more, Samuel Adams says the government is arbitrary and unconstitutional. Well, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about how things are supposed to be, I mean, the largest government in the history of the world is not the land of the free. The largest empire in history is not the land of the free because, as Madison told us, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And we have got a trifecta, the largest military, the largest debts, the largest, well, I don't know if it's the largest taxes, but in many ways, the printing of the money, the inflation, the hidden inflation tax is hitting all of us more and more every single day. So the money that we earn goes less and less. They might as well just send people over to steal it from us. But that's much more difficult, and it creates a situation where you can get more resistance. Anyways, I will look a little bit further in the live chat a little bit later on, and of course, continue leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archive, because that helps the algorithms show us to more people. It really does help out a great deal. Again, the membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can find all the archives at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. I will publish that blog post for this episode in a little while and get all those reference links in there as well. I can't thank you enough for being here. I hope you had a good weekend and your Monday's off to a good start, and I will see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.